Good morning, and thanks so much for joining us for our next session, which is going to be intensely interesting. We are talking conservatives and climate change, opportunities for bipartisan action. I'm Ann Kelly, Vice President of Government Relations here at Ceres, and I'm thrilled to welcome my friend, Chelsea Henderson. Welcome to you, Chelsea. Thanks so much for being here with us. I have been so looking forward to this conversation.
Hi.
You're just a champion of eco-right climate policy. And for 25 years, you have been striking bipartisan deals. And you're now director of editorial content at Republic EN. So why don't you start out by just telling us a little bit about the organization's mission and vision and tell us about what you do.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Likewise, I have been looking forward to this. And it seemed when you first invited me to participate that it was really far off in the future. And this is just endemic of how quickly time seems to be passing right now that here we are today. I have been with republican.org sort of off. I started part-time in, I think, 2014 or 2015. It's been a while. Again, time goes by fast. And they really were very kind to let me create the job that I wanted. So director of editorial content means that I do a couple of things. I really just scan the news every day, looking for those stories that highlight some sort of climate action that has been taken by a Republican lawmaker at all levels of government. So local, state, federal, and even on the stakeholder side as well. And then I compile a newsletter that goes out every Friday to our member base that summarizes the news of the eco-right news of the week, we call it. And for anyone that is interested in getting on that mailing list, you can, we'll make sure that you know how to contact me after, because I find that a lot of people, whether they come at climate change from a conservative angle or not, have told me they find value in just seeing who the players are out there and knowing maybe it helps them know how to talk to Republicans who are advocating for some sort of climate action. And I also host a podcast, which is kind of a new content stream that we developed at the beginning or sometime last summer during the pandemic, when our daily jobs changed a little because our executive director, Bob Inglis, was no longer traveling. Bob goes all across the country talking to conservatives about climate change and why it's important to have that seat at the table or you're going to be on the menu. And he has, I sort of joke that he's trying to convert people one by one, which is a Herculean task, I think. But, really trying to show that we can solve climate change by applying conservative principles to policy. And the way that presents for Republican.org is that we're supportive of a price on carbon. We're a grassroots organization, a 501c3, so we aren't actually advocating for any specific legislation. We'll take any price on carbon at this point, preferably revenue neutral, border adjustable. But yeah, so Bob goes around the country and preaches the gospel, and then we back that up with the content that we're producing just to show people that they aren't alone. There are other conservatives out there who are eager to see action.
Great. Well, let's dig into that a little bit. And thanks for mentioning your podcast, Eco Right Speaks. We'll refer to that again. We want to make sure our listeners have that, and we should pop a link to that in the chat. And you know that Ceres is committed to bipartisan action. We've worked both sides of the aisle for years. We are good friends with your colleague, Bob Inglis. By the way, for those of you who don't know, he's a former Republican congressman from South Carolina, who's deeply committed to putting a price on carbon and to climate action. We also work with the Conservative Energy Network in the States. So we are in this. I've spoken before, the Christian Coalition, about renewable energy and wind power. They had a session called Pushing for Wind Power is as American as Apple Pie. So like I said, we're trying. But I want to start out with an easy question for you, Chelsea, if you would. Why is it so hard for us to get Republicans interested in climate action?
That's an easy question. It's things have changed, right? So I used to be a Senate staffer, and my last tour of duty, as I call it, on Capitol Hill, I worked for Senator John Warner from Virginia and served in his office for the last 2 years of his term. And during that time, he was approached by Joe Lieberman from Connecticut and asked to work on a climate change bill. And in the beginning, we started off tiny, right? We were going to do this little tiny thing, and then it just blossomed into the Lieberman-Warner Climate Security Act. And the reason why it blossomed was because the more Senator Warner heard from stakeholders, not just environmentalists, but he was hearing from US CAP, which I know it was a different entity than what you're doing at Ceres, but I think there's probably some overlap. And at the time, that was a really groundbreaking thing. You had this loose association of corporate interests and some environmental interests, and all the stakeholders coming together and saying, yes, we need to have climate action. And he was really moved by that. We had national security message, so retired flag officers coming in. Senator Warner had been the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, so when they were saying climate change is a national security issue, that also resonated with him. So he was hearing from all these different angles. And at the time, we had 14 or 15 Republicans in the Senate to pursue as co-sponsors. We had a number of co-sponsors who were Republicans on our bill. When we went to the Senate floor, we didn't get the 60 votes needed to overcome the filibuster, but we had, and I'm going to forget what it was, but we got 53 yay votes, and a number of those were Republicans. So times have changed, and here we are, we're much more polarized. And I think that is just a product of how the elections are turning out now, and people getting primaried for their position on climate change, which is what happened to Bob Inglis in 2009. He had this climate epiphany. He went to Greenland and realized that climate change was something that was happening. He talked to scientists. He moved away from what the party line talking points had been at that point, and came back to DC and introduced a carbon tax. And then he was primaried and he lost, and he decided he needed to make this his commitment. So, I don't know why it's harder today, because the stakes are higher. We don't have as much time to come to the table to have solutions or to phase in solutions. So when we were doing the Lieberman-Warner bill, 2050 seemed so far away, and we were going to have this, cap by 2050. And now I think about it just in terms of my own life and my kids' life, and 2030, 2050, these benchmarks are not that far away. So whatever we do end up doing, we're going to have to do it faster. So I don't know. I don't think I really answered why bipartisanship is harder, but it is, and that's just the reality we have to work in. So it means we have to work harder.
For sure. Well, we so appreciate your long-term perspective on this, Chelsea. And I guess what I'm wondering about is whether the politics are getting in the way of the policy. We know that bipartisan majorities on both sides of the aisle support clean energy and climate action. I think many of our members of the audience have read the Yale Climate Communications Study, which we can also put into the chat, which was really reassuring, because you and I both looked at that, and it turns out that the number of people who are dismissing climate action is getting smaller and smaller. The number of people alarmed is getting higher. So I'm just wondering if you think deep down, are there many Republicans who actually would like to vote for climate action, but is the politics of the party, and I'll say both parties, is the politics really getting in the way of what they know is actually the right thing to do?
Absolutely. I think if we had a blind vote on I don't know a carbon tax specifically, but on a climate change package, it would pass both chambers with bipartisan support. There is this, and I feel like the group of people who want to see climate action is growing, right? And we see that not just in the Yale study, but in the polling that is done. When you look at polling of conservatives, those young conservatives, so the next big voting bloc, the Gen Z or Zoomers, whatever you want to call them, and the young millennials, they together make a huge voting bloc. And it's a no-brainer for them. The climate is changing and we need to do something about it. And I feel like that polling is really compelling. That polling plus the engagement of the business community, the engagement of the faith community, the engagement of, we're seeing more ag interest starting to get involved, as evidenced by Senator Braun's Growing Climate Solutions Act. So the more that people who were reluctant to come to the table are coming to the table, I feel like the excuses for being against climate action shrink. But man, they have a toehold, right, on the people who are resistant. We don't see as many flat out climate deniers today as we did, I would say, even 5 years ago. And, having been in this game for a long time, I've seen the the excuses evolve. We didn't really have excuses in 2008, except that it might hurt the economy, raise gas prices. And at that time, gas prices were in the high threes, maybe even hit $4 a gallon. So times were definitely different. We hit the recession and the economic turn down. But today, I feel like it's just harder to make the excuse, right? Because people used to say climate change, it's always been changing, it's not happening. And then that evolved into, I'm not a scientist, but. And today, what you're seeing more people say is climate is changing, and they're not really all in on going on a big solution, but maybe they'll support the Trillion Trees Act or Senator Braun's climate solutions bill, or something that is a smaller bite at the apple. And you know what? I'll take it. That's not what we're advocating for on the daily, but anything that is going to get, sometimes it's baby steps, and you have to get somebody comfortable with a small action so that you can then groom them along to take a big action.
Well, I think you've just given us our first quotable tweet, and this is a live tweeted session. So I want to underscore what you said. You said many important things, but you said that were there to be a secret ballot, that it's quite possible that Republicans of both chambers would in fact get behind climate action. And I think that's really important. And that restores our faith in our conservative colleagues who of course know what is the right thing to do. They see the economic soundness of climate action, the risks of climate inaction. And so let's underscore that. And thank you for highlighting Senator Braun, Republican from Indiana, who has co-sponsored the Growing Climate Solutions Act with Senator Stabenow of Michigan. We are working with them. The bill is really interesting. I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about whether or not sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture is a place where we can build a bridge. And how would you see us doing that? Now, I know you are aware, let me say to the audience, we are aware that the sequestering of carbon by farmers is not an exact science. We are seeking metrics. There's plenty of uncertainty, but there does seem to be a growing consensus around sustainable agriculture writ large, healthy soils, really working with farmers. Can you say any more about that? And do you have hope that that's a place where we can build a bridge?
I do have hope because, again, to sort of go back to my experience, not just in 2007 and 2008, but later when I was the L word, a lobbyist on these issues in 2009, 2010, the agriculture community was really reluctant to engage. And we kept trying to say, but you have opportunities with carbon sequestration. And I feel like it kind of fell on deaf ears. And so today, to see these bridges being built, to me, it means that we're widening that tent of people who want climate action. And that's so, so important. I don't know whether the Growing Climate Solutions Act will ever be enacted, but this process of building support for it and reaching out to an industry that will be impacted by not only climate change, but climate solutions is really important. Now, what I would say toward perfecting carbon sequestration is that if we had a carbon tax, the carbon taxes would incentivize so much innovation, including at the agricultural level. So, there's no silver bullet when it comes to climate change, right? We need to kind of look at, I forget who it was, there was somebody used to talk about the silver buckshot. And I think that's true. There are going to be a lot of different ways that we're going to have to get at the issue, but that agricultural component is really important.
Well, I appreciate that, and certainly appreciate you mentioning carbon pricing, which I want to go into for a moment. But let me tell my audience, if you'd like to submit a question for Chelsea, please put it in the chat. She's been one of our few guests who's been willing to do this live and take live questions. So thank you, Chelsea. And please put those questions forward. Let's talk about carbon pricing for a moment. And I know you know the topic deeply. You know that we have worked very hard on carbon pricing. We did lead on carbon pricing in 2019, and that led to Senator Braun and Senator Coons establishing the Senate Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. I can't say we're 100% responsible, but we were thrilled to see both of them come together and set up the Senate caucus on climate solutions. What I'm wondering about is what is your take on how Republicans would look at the concerns around a carbon price and environmental justice and equity concerns. And we know that there are several, and we know that historically, market mechanisms have really not served frontline disadvantaged communities that have historically taken on such an uneven burden of environmental harm. Would love to get your take on that. And then, of course, if you have thoughts about carbon pricing in this next, the next debate we're about to enter, I'd be interested in that as well.
Sure. So I feel like there is a heightened awareness right now to environmental justice, climate justice, and so with that in mind, I think that we just have to be very cognizant of how we build any sort of carbon pricing mechanism, that we aren't making the mistakes of the past. I happen to live in a county in Maryland that has been on the dumping end of some of the environmental decisions that have been made in the state. And it's really hard to watch. Not far from me are heavy industrial sites. And as those sites are coming up for redevelopment, it's a local issue, it's a county issue, it's a state issue, but it's really hard to get the entities to move toward remediation and to try to put something positive like a park in place. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but we now have the knowledge, and I don't want to insult my, Republican colleagues, but I will say I don't think there is as much awareness on what some of those inequities have been and how they've been caused by market mechanisms. And so continuing to educate our members is an important part of that process, because even in my own team, we talked about this kind of recently, and I felt like I was the one that sort of, knew the most, so to speak. And so just making sure that we're having those open and honest conversations, and that it's built into whatever it is that we develop is going to be really important. And I see with President Biden, he is really elevating the issue in the administration, not just in the CEQ, Council on Environmental Quality, but in the agencies. And so I think that having that level of attention will help as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, we're getting some questions. And let me start out with this one, which is a good one. What are one or two examples of the most effective ways to meaningfully engage Republicans on climate change? And I guess related to that, how do we get it wrong sometimes? What have we done that really hasn't worked?
Bob is really good at addressing this question, so I'm going to mimic him a little bit. You really kind of have to meet people where they are, and there's nothing more insulting than sort of coming at somebody as a know-it-all, right? And I think we feel like this about anything in life, that any conversation that we're having, we don't like to be talked down to. We don't like to feel like somebody's lecturing us, right? So I think engaging on a level that can connect to something that member is interested in, either because there's a district-wide or a statewide interest, or like Senator Braun and the Growing Climate Solutions Act is perfect, right? Because Indiana is an agricultural state. And so that's an area where he's comfortable engaging. If we were to go to him on some aspect of climate change, if it was, for example, the auto industry, he might not be as keen to engage, and might see that more as like, go talk to the Michigan senators. So I think just finding those entrance points is really important. And making sure it's a two-way conversation, that you're hearing what the concerns are. And sometimes those concerns are going to be talking points, and that's terrible. But it doesn't mean that you give up. Listen, every constituent has a voice, whether you live you're talking about your member of Congress or about your senator. And the thing that I'm constantly emphasizing as the director of editorial content, which is writing, it's a fancy way to say that I love writing and I try to write as much as possible and encourage others to use the written word as a tool. If you write a letter to the editor or an op-ed and you mention your lawmakers and that thing gets printed, it's going to appear in their daily clips and they are going to see it. I mean, they might see it if they're just opening the newspaper or they're online anyway, but anything that has a member's name is going to make it from the press team to the lawmaker's desk. And so that's also a really good way to kind of call on members for leadership, or maybe to express a perspective that you might not have the time to in a personal interaction.
Well, thanks so much for suggesting people interacting with their lawmakers. I mean, participatory democracy works when people participate. And on that note, let me invite you all to Lead on Climate May 11th and 12th. This is going to go up in the chat too. That is our massive advocacy day on Capitol Hill. We'll be talking to Republicans and Democrats. And right here and now, Chelsea, let me invite Republic EN to co-sponsor. This is not rehearsed. We'd love to have you a part of this. There's no cost. Democracy is free. It's going to be quite an event. And of course, we're going to be talking about Build Back Better, among other things. Biden's proposal is set to drop next week, and I'm really interested in your gut sense of how Republicans may react to that. But let me link that to a question in the chat, which I think is also germane. It seems like conservative opposition to mandates and centralized controls could be a stumbling block to bipartisan agreement. How can that be overcome? And right away, I can't help but think of the possibility of a clean electricity standard, which I think you know has been proposed. I would love to know your thoughts on what is going to be the reaction to a potential CES, and is a carbon price more likely to be deemed favorable? I know you have an opinion here, but I really would love your thoughts.
I mean, so when we're talking about the Build Back Better infrastructure package as a whole, I think everybody who is participating today knows that infrastructure is traditionally a bipartisan effort. And when I was on the Hill, I worked on water infrastructure. And if there was any discord, it was usually House versus Senate. It wasn't Democrat versus Republican. So I think there's a great opportunity. And, reading a little bit this week about some concerns from Republicans that the Democrats will do kind of the easy stuff in round one under regular order and save the hard stuff for later to do on budget reconciliation. And, I hate those conversations. Let's just go forth now with what we agree on, do what we can. And, is it a clean energy standard? I think with the CES, we end up in that circular debate about whether nuclear is part of that. And I know that is not an old issue that even reckons back to the days when I was on the Hill, which feel like a really long time ago. So the prospects can always look good one moment and then collapse the next moment, unfortunately, which is why I think the constant engagement is really important, and really calling on members to emphasize that bipartisanship is important, and they know it in their guts, right? But we saw it with the passage of almost called him Senator, President Biden's cabinet. So many of those members were passed with, say, like 15 or 16 no votes, and they were all the same, or mostly the same 15 or 16 people. So those guys might not be the ones I would go to preaching a bipartisan kumbaya. But everyone else, I think, is fair game. And at the end of the day, when you look at the polling, when you look at the corporate interests behind these measures, you look at all the stakeholders engaged, that it has to move the needle for some people. And they're also, I think, the more that you have those friendships, so what Senator Coons and Senator Braun are doing in the Senate, and then I know in the past there has been a House Climate Solutions Caucus as well. I don't know if they've officially organized yet this Congress, but those friendships are important, and those connections are important, because then you have that opportunity to get to know somebody from the other side and to trust them. You need to build that trust. Senator Warner said it used to happen over dinner. These days, most members, we're all on Zoom, so no one's having dinner together, but with the pressures of fundraising, you don't have the same member level socializing that you used to. So you have to find those other ways to come together and to experience with good faith effort that you're not trying to kind of gotcha somebody, that you really want to find that path forward together. And I think Senator Coons has been great at doing that, reaching out to the other, to Republicans. And so finding those centered lawmakers who can do that and who can be also good messengers then for their side. So it's not enough that Coons and Braun are together talking. Then Senator Braun has to go and talk to his people and say, this stuff is legit. And Senator Coons has to go to his people and say, that side is legit too. And eventually we'll hopefully all come together. And in terms of mandates and controls, that is a harder pill to swallow. But kind of the beautiful thing, I guess, or maybe depending on your perspective, not beautiful thing about the infrastructure bill is there's something for everybody. So maybe part of the price of accepting some mandates or some kind of more command and control approaches is that that member is going to get something that they want. And, unfortunately, it's just how the sausage is made. So finding those trades will be important. And I'm just glad I'm not in charge of having to do that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, just to make sure our listeners understand, what you're suggesting is through regular order, we would need 10 Republicans, and we're all interested in, what are those elements that could be put into a package. But you make a really valid point that under COVID, those informal interactions are very difficult to have. And in particular, I suspect that they all miss the importance of the bipartisan prayer breakfast, which of course was established back by President Eisenhower. But I had one senator tell me that these are some of the most meaningful interactions he has with his colleagues on the other side, obviously 100% confidential, but that he said it's a very lonely job to be a senator, and that's a place where one can pour one's heart out and where there are some real bonds made. I have to believe that some of those bonds extend into the larger lawmaking. That's probably a hopeful note. But I'm getting a couple more questions here, and this one I think is spot on. Can you talk about messaging examples or leaders in the area of just transition? And just transition, of course, has long been put forward by the labor community. We know that there are former fossil fuel and coal workers that are going to be looking to be retrained and reemployed. This issue also comes up in the environmental justice context. And again, if you go back to the Yale study, bipartisan majorities support just transition and the retraining of particularly former fossil fuel workers. Is this area going to gain traction? Could that be a part of Build Back Better that folks could get behind?
Again, thank you. I think it comes down to how the messaging is triggered, right? So I know, and Frank Luntz has done some polling on, words to use and words to lose. And so one thing that he says is to not talk about green jobs, because in a way that's almost like a trigger word now. People don't want to hear about green jobs. They have careers. And so when you talk about a job, it doesn't feel as meaningful maybe as a career. So he has a whole long spiel about talking, how to frame some of these issues so that they really resonate with the people who are at the heart of it. And I understand if you have worked in the fossil fuel industry your whole life and you're, the legacy, maybe your parents and grandparents also worked in that industry. It's really hard to feel like, well, the people in Washington are going to come in and tell me that now I have to do solar panels or whatever the alternative is. So I think having that level of engagement, which I'm sure the unions are doing at the hyper local level, and then also not pandering and not being condescending, and really showing by example other areas where it's worked, other areas where people have left the fossil fuel industry and embraced jobs that, perhaps pay better, perhaps were healthier. I'm thinking about the coal miners. It's, to me, that seems like such a part of the legacy of people who live in the areas where they coal mine, that it's almost hard to see through that there could be other opportunities. So it is a very difficult messaging, and I'm glad that some super smart people are on it, because that just transition is going to be a critical part of people embracing what we want to see done.
Yeah, absolutely. That leads me to wonder about Senator Manchin, and I'm getting a question about the degree to which now you talk about working the eco right, and I wonder, the question is about whether you ever work middle Democrats like Senator Manchin and potentially Senator Sinema and others who have mixed constituencies and may have mixed views.
This has come up in conversation recently, and we haven't done that direct outreach, but I think it makes sense to, in today's, very, 50-50 Senate, and those members are more conservative, and probably, I'm guessing that we're more aligned with like a Senator Sinema and a Senator Manchin than we are with some people on the Republican side. So kind of finding those new champions is important, because they're important, right? We need to have them on our side. And so I would love to expand the term eco-right to include folks like them, for sure.
Absolutely, as long as it's not eco-wrong. For hours, Chelsea, I want you to lead the Republican Party, just saying. I think that would solve all of our problems. 20 seconds to give our audience your sense of hope. What gives you hope right now about a forward path for bipartisan action?
It's the young people, right? So I feel old saying that, but the ACC and some of these, or Students for Carbon Dividends and Young Conservatives for Carbon Dividends, those groups are super smart and they're savvy and they're connected and they're getting out there and they're talking to their lawmakers. And I tell them all the time, like, they are going to be lawmakers someday. And I just have all the faith. I've had them as guests on the Eco Right Speaks. Any of your members that want to be a guest and talk about climate corporate interest, I'm happy to have them. They can contact me through you. I think that has been a great way to get those voices out, and that's really important today. Everyone needs their voice heard.
Well, couldn't agree with you more, Chelsea. Thank you for that note. And to my audience, please join me in thanking Chelsea Henderson, both for her remarks today and for her vital work with Republican EN. And to all of you, you too can lead on climate. Help